All right. Welcome everybody to yet another session of the Fourth Generation Initiative. Today we are beginning particularly on our series of discussions which will be particular to Uganda, and we'll be addressing the phenomenon of the political party, or the party, which is quite a curious animal in African politics, but also in politics generally, right? You see the party feature a lot in discussions, on African politics. You see different manifestations of the party. And I think to start today's episode, or today's conversation, I want to just, quote a bit of an article recently in the Monitor, and then in the spirit of the fourth generation, we'll try and historicize, how we've come to be where we are as a country, while making some appraisals of what our current system looks like as it pertains to the party. So there's an article recently in the Monitor, which is still under censure, by the state with its affiliated Nation Media Group, and the article is by a professor, I believe, of language, called Dr. Samuel Andema, who writes From Liberation to Moral Decay. He says, in Darkness at Noon, a Hungarian writer, Arthur Koestler, depicts revolutions as pendulums that swing violently from oppression to liberation, from virtue to corruption, until the moral energy that gave them life dissipates. Without ethical renewal, and we will talk about this idea of ethics, Koestler warns, revolutions become indistinguishable from the tyrannies they overthrew. His insight hauntingly mirrors Uganda's story under President Museveni. Nearly 40 years after the guns of Luero fell silent, the revolution that promised to rebuild Uganda has turned into the very monster it once vowed to destroy. When the national resistance movement captured power in 1986, it ushered in euphoria and hope. The 10-point program, the moral compass of the new order, promised democracy, an end to corruption, national unity, and self-reliance. Ugandans believed that the bloodshed in Luero would purchase freedom and dignity for all. Yet 4 decades later, those ideals have been betrayed. Corruption has become systemic, nepotism entrenched, and the dream of democracy hollowed out by perpetual rule, so it says, sorry, I'll pick up from that. So it says, the pendulum, rather, I'll pick up from the corruption bit. It says, corruption has become systemic, nepotism has entrenched, and the dream of democracy hollowed out by perpetual rule, electoral manipulation, and the militarization of civic life. The pendulum has swung full circle. Yesterday's liberators, now the guards of decay. Nowhere is this collapse clearer than in Uganda's institutions of governance. Parliament, once envisioned as the people's watchdog, has become a marketplace for inducements and presidential patronage. The judiciary, intended to be the bulwark of justice, bows to executive pressure. Districts are multiplied, not for service delivery, but for political convenience. The parish development model, once sold as a poverty reduction miracle, now serves as a tool for regime mobilization. Even anti-corruption campaigns have turned into spectacles of selective morality. Small offenders paraded as scapegoats, while the powerful swim freely in the lake of impunity. Uganda today survives not on legitimacy, but on the illusion of moral purpose. At the community level, moral corrosion has seeped deep into the national conscience. The young no longer associate success with diligence, but with proximity to power. Teachers strike for months over salary disparities, while ministers speed past them in field guzzling convoys. Health workers improvise gloves from polythene bags, while billions vanish in procurement scandals. From the Karamoja iron sheet saga to the theft of COVID-19 relief funds, corruption scandals have become so common that outrage has turned into resignation. This is more than economic collapse. It's the erosion of moral imagination, where corruption shocks no one and honesty is mocked as naivety. This moral decay explains why opposition politicians keep crossing to the NRM under the guise of national dialogue or strategic cooperation, in quotes. Once fiery critics now defend the regime they once denounced. Former opposition MPs who thundered against injustice have been rewarded with ministerial posts and contracts. Their defections are less about strategy than surrender. Proof of Koestler's warning that when revolutions lose their moral core, even dissent bends the gravitational pull of power. Uganda's political pendulum no longer swings between principle and ideology. It swings between convenience and compromise. Uganda now hangs in the darkest arc of its pendulum, Disillusionment has replaced faith, and fear has silenced outrage. The promise of fundamental change has devolved into the culture of survival, where citizens barter conscience for comfort and security for security. Yet Kostler reminds us that the pendulum can swing again, if and only if a new moral awakening stirs. Uganda's renewal will not come from another armed struggle, no recycled political slogans, but from a collective reawakening of conscience rooted in truth, justice, and accountability. The revolution's redemption lies not in power, but in principle. Ugandans must rekindle the ethical spirit that once animated the struggle, demanding decency, honesty, fairness from those who govern and from themselves. Only through a moral insurgency, a peaceful uprising of conscience, can this weary nation halt its descent. The article was written on November 13th, 2025. So that was last Thursday in the Monitor. And I think it's going to be for us a good entry point. Obviously, he has very specific conclusions that he has reached about the fact that ethics are the final, or at least the biggest issue that we are facing as a country, as far as this current state of our politics is concerned. So the question we're asking ourselves as we go through this ideological college series in trying to understand Uganda and its politics is to try and make sense of what is at stake, if anything, really, in 2026. And we will, throughout the course of the discussion, try and dig into various aspects of that narration by that professor. But I want us to, again, in the spirit of the initiative, try and trace where did we start from as far as the political party is concerned. Where did the idea of a party come from in Uganda historically? What conditions necessitated the rise of the party, and how did that evolve initially? What were the characters of those parties that we had from the immediate independence to the post-independence period? Manzi, I'll call on you to give us this characterization.
No, thanks very much, Olemo. Once again, I'm glad to be here, glad to be engaging in dialogue, in conversation, in a trading of ideas around an attempt to make sense of the reality of both public and private aspirations that we have. And just to confirm, can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, fantastic. Yeah, so the urge, the yearning for change
I believe we lost you there. Comrade Twahiirwa, can you hear Manzi?
Sorry, I must have dropped a little.
Okay, yeah, we lost you for a second, but you're back now.
Okay, I'll proceed. Yeah, so happy to be here and to continue with this conversation, or at least to add to it. So the political party as a phenomenon in recent and contemporary Ugandan politics. I would like to start, of course, from what would be a chronological point of departure. I am tempted to do so because I see no better way to explain the evolution of multi-party politics as it has been practiced in Uganda. But perhaps I will not follow that chronology linearly in this opening statement that I'll make. But we all know how Uganda gets its independence, 1962, and the agitations that occur leading to that moment are, I think, what would be best agreed upon as the nursery bed in which the modern political parties were formed. I think if I am not mistaken, and gentlemen, you will correct me as the conversation goes ahead, it was Musaazi and his agitation for farmers that really gets us started. The farmers associations trying to get fairer shares of the cotton business to begin with. I'm not too sure about other cash crops that existed under the colonial economy at the time, tobacco in the north, perhaps coffee in parts of Bugisu and the east, but cotton largely within Uganda. And Ignatius Musaazi being a colonial subject of the British Protectorate that was limited to the Buganda province of the Protectorate, definitely saw himself as first and foremost defending and championing the interests of his immediate constituency, which was cotton farmers within this region. But I think that while it may have started as a very narrow interest-specific agitation, it quickly gained momentum with other actors across the country and across the chessboard of Ugandan political life at the time, gaining an interest, and then that's how the Uganda National Congress eventually takes shape as an amalgamation of African interests, which is to say black, or at least predominantly black interests, who then were pitted against the non-black actors in the protectorate system at the time, the Asian merchant class on the one hand, and then the British governing political class on the other. So from that point on, then the parties that later gained notoriety in the immediate post-independence period begin to emerge. The Uganda People's Congress eventually was formed as a splinter group from the Uganda National Congress by Apollo Milton Obote, who later went on to become our first post-independence prime minister. And then we have the Democratic Party eventually emerging outside the interests of the Catholic minority within Buganda wanting an independent political voice. And we can always add flesh to some of these ideas and claims later on, but I'm just trying to give a very brief and perhaps not as detailed overview of what the inspiration for some of this interest formation was at the time. Kabaka Yekka, of course, emerges as a Buganda Mengo establishment party that seeks to, I think, at the heart of it, channel a subnational interest for Buganda, which had no interest at all in gaining its independence alongside the rest of the protectorate at the time. I think they eventually enter into this alliance with UPC in the hope that after the granting of independence to Buganda, a very effective federal system would then be implemented that would allow Buganda as a polity to exercise effective autonomy over its affairs. Unfortunately, that did not work out the way they anticipated, and we have therefore a kind of very dysfunctional republic to date, but at least it is a republic. So I would say, in my view, and to just try and conclude these opening remarks, I would say the party emerges as steward, as a custodian of sectarian interests right from the get-go. Each of the parties, to a varying degree, claims to be spearheading or to be a spokesperson for this shared, common, multicultural, multi-interest kind of national goal. But when you look at the practice, when you look at the philosophy, the ideology of each of the parties, and who the leaders, who the elites in each of the parties are, you see quite categorically, quite irrefutably, a very sectarian, very specific interest formation and interest definition. So I think that our political parties, historically and in the contemporary sense, have not departed from that character of identifying an interest group and then champion.
Manzi, thank you very much for that intro, because I think that background is key, particularly tracing it from the immediate post-independence period, because it's very easy, right? I was speaking with a friend the other day. They're in South Africa. And the thinking was that when you talk of the national liberation movement, and even the article that I read at the beginning of this conversation, the starting point for the history of Uganda in the contemporary mind that is not very critical about the history of the country normally starts from 1986 and the national resistance movement and national resistance army, right? So when we talk of the dissipation, or when we talk of the unraveling of national liberation movements on the African continent, there's a tendency to always associate that with the national resistance movement, the NRM, right? People often forget, the preceding history of how we've had different political formations that have championed some kind of national agenda, right? And we can say maybe that was a deliberate beat on the part of the NRM, that the way that they have curated their narrative and their story and their intervention in Uganda. The history of the country almost always will begin with them and the capture of Kampala in January 86. But I think that history then is very important. For me, a point of curiosity would be, and Comrade Twahiirwa, anybody feel free to come into this, but the question of, if you look around the entire continent, obviously ours was a negotiated independence, right? We did not take up arms against the colonial government, the British colonial government. There was a negotiation that was involved. An election, I believe, was contested prior to the handover of the instruments of power to that UPC, Kabaka Yekka coalition, right? That eventually, again, ended up crumbling. But if you look around the entire continent, there was always a national liberation movement that championed the cause of the entire nation. Now, it wasn't always very neat, but in Tanzania, you can always point to CCM. Obviously, before CCM, there was TANU, which represented the interests of Tanganyika, and what was the name of the other party in Zanzibar? There was another party in Zanzibar.
Afro Shiraz.
Yeah, I think Afro Shiraz. Yes, that represented the interests of the Zanzibaris before that eventual unification of Tanzania and Zanzibar. In Kenya, I think you have KANU. In South Africa, you have the ANC that is leading the negotiations. Of some people now claim that they sold out at CODESA. And other formations like PAC. So you have those contestations between different political formations that are all championing a national agenda, right? In Angola, you have parties like UNATU or UNITA, I believe. You have the MPLA, right? In Zimbabwe, you have ZANU-PF, Mugabe ZANU-PF, and you have all these political formations around the continent that are all, you have the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, with Cabral and everyone, and you have all these parties that are championing a national agenda. Why then, at the instantiation of our history, are we having sectarian formations, emerging, along religious lines and tribal lines from the get-go, as opposed to one movement that kind of subsumes all these interests, right, and expresses a national program.
Okay, I would like to hear Comrade Twahiirwa's thoughts on this, but let me just quickly attempt to respond to your question. I feel like one of the great conflicts of interest that any player in the immediate post-independence political period of Uganda had was deciding whether it was a blessing for us not to have violently contested the anti-colonial struggle, or whether it was a curse. Because what that meant was that without this violent upheaval and changing of guards from the colonial to the post-colonial order, you had a maintaining of the system as it was, and simply a changing of the faces and the office bearers, rather than a structural transformation of the entire structure as it was set up. So the way Uganda was governed prior to its independence is exactly the way it was governed immediately after its independence, simply that we now had Black African office bearers, and some would go as far as arguing it is precisely the same way it is being governed today. Of course, Amin, perhaps with all the chaos and anarchy that is attendant to his regime, might have been the only true revolutionary we have had in the entire political history of the country, because he shook up a system with the expulsion of the Asians, with the nationalization of land, a true agrarian revolution in the very specific sense of the word, an attempt to change those who own the factors and means of production, happened during his time. Of course, it was saddled with a lot of death and suffering and lack, and an international slew of sanctions that punished the economy and individual citizens. But when it is looked at retrospectively, perhaps that is the only phase that we had a real, genuine attempt at changing the system from the ground up. But not to let that detain us. I think that it is that lack of the need for violent revolution that perhaps may have contributed to the sectarianism that we saw, because the colonial system was arranged in such a way as to selectively privilege, to fragment the African population, to fragment the governed, and kind of limit them into these customary tribal ethnic jurisdictions. And Mamdani, I think, is the foremost scholar on this subject, where he talks about citizen and subject and how it's important in the colonial logic to completely sever or break the link between the African and his sense of nationhood in a multicultural sense, and limit the African to looking at themselves as a member of a tribe and subject to customary law, therefore. And so this completely demobilizes any potential for the Africans to unite together against this ruling British minority that, was very disproportionately outnumbered, if only the Africans could have figured out that they all had the same interests and they were not necessarily as different or as distinct in their identity as they were made out to be. Yep, that would be my
Yeah, and I think that intervention is important because there's a lecture that Dr. Lushaba delivers on the pitfalls of national reform, a play of words of Fanon's, a chapter of Fanon's book by the same by I think Pitfalls of National Consciousness is what he called it, and obviously you all know Fanon's argument around how the actual fight for national liberation is what helps to forge this sense of helps to forge a national consciousness, right, in the first place, that we can conceive of the idea of one Uganda if we've all fought for it, right? That national identity is forged in the fight for national liberation. And I think that intervention is important. Museveni reflects on this as well. The president reflects on this in his undergrad thesis when he talks about his trip to Mozambique and the effects of that violent struggle against the colonial government or against the Portuguese then on the psyche of the ground forces, of the man on the ground, right, that is fighting for national liberation. Obviously, there's this idea of the nation that you have in your mind that you're fighting for, and with such fights, if you think about the FLN, for example, in Algeria, you are mobilizing from the countryside. So already you have a presence of folks who historically for Uganda have been, marginalized. If you have a presence of those folks coming in to fight for this bigger, much bigger idea of the nation, then you have at least an ability to transcend what you can think of as these sectarian divisions, the biggest one being tribe. You think about contemporary Uganda and how tribalism is still an issue. It's only, and that's an issue even that a lot of folks that are in the political class, the elites, really tap into in order to mobilize themselves nationally, right? So I think that definitely is quite important. The fact that the fight for national liberation, if it's a violent one, it has a tendency to help people, conceive of a national identity outside the parochial and chauvinistic affiliations that they have, prior to that fight. So I think that is definitely important. Obviously, Amin ran almost, not almost, but a no-party state essentially. So would it be fair to say then that he's the origin of this understanding of what would then later on become the movement system or the no-party system? The no party or the one party system, as many people have tried to characterize it differently depending on the camps that they belong to, that then President Museveni brings in 1986. And again, I asked this question with the preface of, when we think about, and the president has made this case several times, when you think about most parties in Europe and the West, which we have constantly set as our example of mimicry, there are parties that are formed along class lines, right? Because of the degree of sort of the level of the heightening of like social classes, contradictions in society, particularly owing to industrialization between the class of workers and the class of the propertied classes. That you have parties that then can say we're a party that represents the interests of big business. We have parties that represent the working class, right? And hence you see all these calls for ideas like socialism and communism that proceed from this fight for the disenfranchised in society. Whereas in our case, the only cleavages that have been formed over time because of colonialism are these cleavages along tribal lines. That colonialism was also that the colonial class was the colonial state was very intentional about continuously, stirring up those divisions. So then people formed these parties along their tribes. Obviously, you have the Buganda problem as well, a kingdom that has had a history of centralization, that is not really interested at all in this entire, national project.
Or should we call it the Buganda question?
The Buganda question.
To be less controversial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, would you then, if you think about it in that sense, that we are parties, and if you have a party that is, mobilizing along religious lines, along tribal lines, then the movement system, the movement being big umbrella or a broad-based mass party, right, that encapsulates the interests of the whole country, that sort of portends a national agenda, would you then say that that is a political innovation for the NRM, and it's something that we should give them their credit where it's due?
I'm not too sure about it being a political innovation, but I would like Comrade Twahiirwa to weigh in at this point. Comrade Twahiirwa,
I think
were you able to?
he missed the introductory bit to that question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, brothers.
Yeah.
For this great initiative, Comrade Olemo. It's great. The party system in Uganda started around, I think, if I'm to remember, around 1946. The one of Bataka. I think you highlighted about that. So, but the Bataka issue highlights the way parties are formed. Political parties are good systems if they are driven by purpose and duty. However, if you look into our setting, right from the 1946, the Bataka Party, the people who were forming it were the Bataka, people who own land, like who have control of land on behalf of the king. And so their issues were around Uganda issues, clans, and so on and so forth. So they had legitimate plans because, as you can see right from there up to the time of independence, parties were forming around based on prevailing circumstances. Brother Olemo spoke about something that in Uganda for us, it was handed over, the independence. People went into the real systems of the colonialists and formed the exact system, political parties, something like that. So, because for us, the prevailing circumstances did not entail the use of violence, even if some of them, like the rebellions, the ones of Kawalega, Mwanga, they had some bit of resistance, plus other areas. But the party system is one that brings organization into society. So it always rises from the prevailing circumstances. What are the needs at the time of the people? So for us at the time of independence, with the colonial system, our people were divided along ethnicities, tribes, and all that. So most of the parties, like Kabaka Yekka, was for the king alone, because that was the interest of the people who were behind the formation of that party. The same with UPC. It was a Congress. It was I think UPC's formation was a merger between UNC, Uganda National Congress. So I think they had similar interests, and political parties. Political parties are also vehicles of marriages of convenience. Yes. So for a country like the way political parties participate in society is usually from what are the needs of the people, what needs to be done at a particular time. So yes, for the
yes, and comrade, just to point out something there. It's something you bring up, which is very important, is also the role, and we spoke about elitism, Comrade Manzi, if you remember, in the previous conversation that we had on leadership preparation, that the elites play a very prominent role in the formation of these parties. I mean, part of it might be their access to some of the resources, their proximity as well. If you think about them as the national middle class, right, that inherits the colonial state, their proximity to that and the amount of preparation that they have had prior to be at the forefront of the formation of these vehicles that would be the purveyors, or at least who should be the representation of the interests of the people. So I think there's that role of the elites that you've pointed out in the formation of these parties. I've been, again, investigating a bit of the origins of or at least reading some material about the origins of even the idea of the Communist Party in Europe. And look at the fact that, contrary to some of the attempts by these guys to revise history, some of these guys, some of the people who are you think about the authors of the Communist Manifesto, for example, these are elites who are setting an agenda, right? These are people who have some amount of access to scholarship, to all these spaces that are setting an agenda that then is taken up by the people. If you think about the likes of Lenin, like these are proper, well-educated, folks who then people have accused Lenin, for example, of being an opportunist. With his approach to what we now later on came to know as the Leninist party that has had a legacy across the world. So I think the role of educated elites in all of the formations of these social, of these social movements cannot definitely be taken away. Yeah, Manzi, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think every movement, every attempt to change society for the better needs some sort of leadership. It needs a voice. It needs a theorist on the one hand, and those who have either been trained or taken through some system of education to acquire enough knowledge that then allows them to emerge as the opinion leaders, as thought leaders, or as people that are respected by a significant demographic, a critical mass, as knowing the way and being able to show the way will definitely have an advantage. And every society has different standards and different criteria through which they allow these leaders to emerge. And unfortunately, the way many African states in their current form were given birth to is that it is those that had been schooled through colonial systems, those were being prepared to be clerks or some other sort of native intelligentsia by whatever colonial system was in charge of your part of the continent. They are the ones who then are looked upon as the natural leaders of both the struggle against colonialism and whatever state emerged from that struggle. So that it becomes a contradiction in terms that those who lead the revolution and are seen as having the capacity to break down systems of exploitation and inequity were produced by those very systems of inequity and exploitation. So how possible was it for them to commit class suicide becomes the elephant in the room. And I think,
Go ahead. I mean, the Marxists speak about every social system concerning the germs of their own demise. But again, that as I think for Uganda also brought in something that people have problematized a lot, and that's the question of personalities. How most of these parties that we've had over time then only have as much longevity and stay as the personalities that are the helm and that have been formed around, right? So you have later on, when we have the multi-party system, coming in 2005, and later on, you have the parties formed around individuals. Of course, there's the constituencies that individual represents, but then you have individuals like Apollo Milton Obote, right, of UPC. You have FDC and Besije, and you now have the NRM, obviously, with Museveni. You have NUP now with Robert Sentamu Chagulanyi at the helm. So is this both and obviously this, because these parties are not very entrenched, save for the National Liberation Movement, you find a tendency that once the personality at the helm of the party leaves because of lack of institutionalization, then the parties pretty much disappear and they lose their national appeal beyond the immediate constituency that they are formed against. Is this issue, does it have a particularly Ugandan character? And how does one, is it a necessary evil that you cannot but form a political party, because I remember when I was in South Africa, there was a question around, for example, the economic freedom fighters, right? And the EFF tried to do something. They shared a survey to show that the party, the economic freedom fighters generally, had now become more popular than its leader, Julius Malema, right? But when you think of the EFF, most people will think of Julius Malema. So they are trying to identify this Ipsos survey. I think Ipsos is a company that does a lot of these nationally representative surveys. And they had cited that the EFF had now, for the first time, at that point, become more popular than its leader. So there's that tendency of parties to say, okay, we are bigger than just these personalities that we are formed, around. So what is are there dangers to this? What is the problem that it portends? Is it inevitable that you will form political parties around personalities and individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to take a quick stab at it, and then maybe Twahiirwa can also weigh in. I think it is inevitable that people, constituencies, populations gravitate around individuals, but not simply because the individuals are unique, but because those individuals represent certain yearnings, certain desires, certain aspirations. And in the absence of those individuals, one fails to find an institutional receptacle, an institutional container for those yearnings. And so then you reach out for something else. One very potent or vivid example close to home is, for example, how Buganda as a constituency, as a collective political player on the Ugandan landscape, has endured the onslaught of multiple governments and multiple changes of a political order. And I think that the greatest asset that community has is the institution of the Kabakaship. Because the Kabakaship was not just Mutesa II, it wasn't Mwanga, it is not Mutebi, who is the contemporary bearer of that office. It is this idea, it is a myth, even a legitimizing myth, that allows people from generation to generation to feel that they are part of something, that they aspire towards something, and that they are willing to give their resources, give their time, even in some cases give their lives to defend this thing, and even to have the faith and the confidence that it may not be realized in their lifetime, and perhaps not even in their children's lifetime, but at some point in the future, some distant, unnameable, indiscrete point, that goal, that aspiration will be achieved. And I think that's what political parties and the individuals in charge of those parties try to channelize, try to embody. Now, if you compare the evanescence of this phenomenon in Africa, or the short-livedness of it, I think it is because we are yet to come to a point of social equilibrium where the leading elites contesting for space in the political arena agree, for example, on a configuration that works. Look at what the so-called two great bastions of democracy in the West have done, the UK and the US. They have developed this two-party system, okay? You have Labour and Conservatives in Britain, and then Democrats and Republicans in the US. Of course, there are many other players, but they will never threaten this two-headed hydra or behemoth that is at the center stage of political activity in these two societies. And when you look at why these two parties and these double-headed systems work, it is because they have created an environment in which citizens on either side feel that they have a degree of choice in the type of society they would like to fashion, depending on who is in charge of the levers of power during that particular term. But then they are also sufficiently similar in each claiming that they are doing this for the good of the nation as a whole. So there is an inbuilt two-sided kind of dynamic in which on the one hand you feel that you're behaving differently from your opponents, but at the same time you share the ultimate vision or mission of nation building. And perhaps Africans, in trying to rethink the political formations we have today and that we wish to have in the future, we may want to borrow from that. I think that the two-party system is a lot more effective than this endless little fragmentary system of parties that we have on the continent, which has even failed to work, for example, for mainland Europe. You look at all these Scandinavian countries, you look at Central European countries with their little endless profusion of parties. They're always having hung parliaments, and they're going, to elections every 2 years because the prime minister can't seem to secure a majority, and then they have enough resources to go around in that circus, of wasting time and political energy. But we in Uganda, we don't have time for that, where the political party is collapsing every 2 months.
Every year, you'll never go anywhere.
Exactly.
But so Comrade Manzi, and I think I'm going to have to segue this discussion to the movement, right? Because you identify that bit about time, like whether we have the time, and this is an argument definitely that people have made before in Africa to justify a single party or no party system, right? You remember the fate of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. His people accused him of dictatorship, fostering one-party rule. The CIA external actors, of course, intervened as well in stoking some of those frustrations. And before you knew it, the man was out of the picture, and the party that he had led. So there is that understanding that, okay, do we, but also not only in terms of time, but also do we have such a diversity of interests? Now, you mentioned two-party systems, for example, in America. You have the Democrats and the Republicans, right, which have this kind of hegemony in the political system. Now, the obvious challenge with that inevitably is when there's a handshake that happens between the two parties. And when eventually it turns out that they do not represent as varied interests as they claim on paper. So it's very possible that few players on the field can sell out everybody else. In America, every party keeps accusing the other of selling out to corporate interests, for example, right? The Democrats are accusing the Republicans, and then everybody is coming out as an outsider. Obama is claiming he's an outsider. Trump is also claiming he's an outsider, and they are all trying to drain the swamp. So you see that issue then coming up. And you said, for example, the case of the UK, the Labour Party, even folks that align with that leftist agenda, people feel like the Labour Party are sold out, right? If you think about the positions that they took on what was happening in the Middle East, but also how there have been more of a centrist formation than a leftist formation, for many people that have subscribed to a leftist agenda. So you have people like Jeremy Corbyn have now disassociated themselves with Labour. People claim not to recommend to understand or recognize the Labour of Keir Starmer anymore. So you have that danger of saying that if we have only a two-party system, what if they have a handshake, and that handshake is not in service of the broader public, but it's what we call the wananchi, or the people at the grassroots. In my language, we call them otedero, people who are the ordinary man, the day-to-day man, so there can be that compromise. But if you're going back to, and this was the intervention of the National Liberation Movements, to think about the party as the expression of the collective will of a people. In the fight against colonialism, the people desire political independence. And so we only need one movement that is not composed of sellouts, one movement that is going to embody that aspiration and act as the instrument through which people are going to be mobilized and led in achieving that aspiration, right? So the party has a purpose. Obviously, after the attainment of political independence, you now reach a different phase of the struggle. You now have to engage the question of nation building and development, progress. After we've achieved independence, how do we now move forward as a country, which different national liberation movements have handled differently? So the movement system then is what I'm interested in us talking about. Do you think when we say it's a political innovation, in the sense in which it claimed at that time to embody the aspirations of all Ugandans, which they distilled, for example, in their 10-point program, to say that we understand that the agenda for Ugandans is one. We want to move forward. And so we do not need all these other political parties. We do not need the Democratic Party because it's sectarian. We do not need the UPC because it's representing a particular constituency and Buganda. We're going to, abolish all political parties, and we're going to contest elections through this singular instrument and the movement system, right? That then is this bastion of democracy. Another question that I have, in addition to that, is when I was in South Africa, one of the things that I observed was just the level of politicization of the society. How engaged people were with the idea of what was happening. People were not as, at least I felt that a lot of people were not as disengaged, from the understanding of who is in power, what are they doing, what is my interest in this guy, in these guys rather, as we are. Maybe that may have to do with just how short-lived they are, how recent the struggle is in their mindset, and that there was actually a system that they had to fight against. But I don't know whether we've been able to achieve the level of politicization that we have as a country from when the movement came about, right? And just the level of democratic involvement of the people. Today we talk of democracy, the democratic involvement of majority of people with the movement. And the reason why I believe the movement is important to discuss is anybody else who wants to come up with an alternative has to first think about what has been. So what is our appraisal of this system that the NRA brought up? Commentary here, I think this would be a good chance for you to chime in. You're muted. You're still muted.
Yes, I had some network issues. So first, help me rephrase the question.
Yeah, so we are thinking about the movement system that the
Yes.
NRA came up with,
Yes.
And how much of a political innovation we think it is, but also just generally an appraisal of it in regard to, you mentioned, for example, earlier that political parties should be formed out of duty, right? And out of the aspirations of people. Was this the ultimate panacea? Was this the ultimate solution to the historic problems that we've had as a country, and maybe the contemporary ones as well?
The movement system that the NRM introduced around 1986, if I stand to be corrected. Some of the claims that the reason why the NRA first introduced that was that there was a bit of division among the people in the country based on the sectarianism and all that. So they brought in the movement system as a means of unity, to unify and try to have one vehicle that drives the country forward. That's why it had people from even various parties and to be able to, they had people from various parties to be able to participate in the nation building. And then two, it was a way of trying to set the country in a way that the people themselves can. It wanted to. Pardon me. Yes, the movement system. Much as it had better opportunities, to national unification. But there are people who saw it as a means of the new government trying to consolidate itself. You get? So the movement system which the NRM was introducing as a vehicle to unify the nation, other politicians were trying to bring in confusion, saying that okay, I cannot object their opinion, but however, it's a system that the NRM was driving to national unity. So it helped a bit because for those 10 years from around 86 to 95 to 96, when we went to another election in that same system, there was some bit of sanity. The anarchy that used to be there previously was a bit reduced, curbed, and so that's how it happened. So, Brother Manzi, I don't know if you can.
Yeah, would you say? I mean, you bring up something important. That's the question of legitimacy. Obviously, the NRM fought a war. They prosecuted a civil war to come to power, right?
Yes.
And I mean, people would say there was no legitimacy. What is this NRM to a guy in Lira somewhere, right? Obviously, they'll claim to have done a lot of mobilization, that people on the ground trying to mobilize around the areas that they claim to have liberated, and everything. But they had no constituency along. For people would say, okay, the West, where the leader of the party and maybe a couple of the members came from, but they had to have some form of legitimacy in the country. Now, they had their history, they had their fight against Amin and the sort of socioeconomic turmoil that we had before them, as a legitimizing tool, but also to form structures, the grassroots, that had to come from somewhere. And that's where now the resistance council system helps, right? And the LC system eventually, which became of it, helps in saying, okay, we're now establishing these structures at the grassroots that we can draw on. And that has helped up to today. You see how the movement is the only party that is actually that's deeply embedded, in around the country at large. So definitely, I agree with you that it helped a lot in terms of unity. But does this mean that for us as a country, then this was the highest stage, expression of democracy, or the closest that we've had or reached in our history?
Well, like I've said, systems spring up based on what's prevailing at the moment. So if the people who are introducing this system thought through it that for now, look if you look at 1980, if you look at in the 60s, the confusion was coming because of political parties and all the division. So it was easy. It was easy for the time being to sell such an idea to the masses, because it was brought in as a mass, something to do with the masses, like bring closer to them. That's why it had local councils, whereby it would there was easy communication between the governing bodies and the masses. You get? So even if there are some who say that they were trying to bring a replica of the CCM in Tanzania, but the other one was more of like they were saying this one would be temporary, and indeed it was temporary, because in 2005 we shifted to the other side when we were like, at least now the country can be able to contain multipartyism, even if we have seen subscription rate from 2006, 2001. We have seen that multi-parties as more of like there are those who practice democracy, there are those who practice the other ideologies. So it's a bit of
So
forgive me for not being official.
No. So would we say then that because one of the things we have to do is to be very honest in our appraisal of things, right? What has changed substantially about the makeup of the Ugandan society that warranted the introduction of multipartyism? Obviously, people will claim that middle classers were hoodwinked by concepts of democracy that existed in the West, and obviously we did not embrace multipartyism, just like we did not embrace neoliberal reform because we liked it, right? The president has been very honest about that. There was a lot of external inducement when you think about this agenda of democratization that the West was spreading in all the world, that you cannot have such a political machinery in place. I was looking at something that Sejusa, the General Sejusa, was saying that you people you gave in to all this agenda of the West, and then you forgot that you actually have your own problems that you had to innovate for. So what changed significantly about the makeup of the Ugandan system that warranted a reversion to multi-party politics? Was there anything at all? Or it's only those suspicions around what the intent and the interest of the National Resistance Army and movement that was enough to justify that? Because it's not like our interest as a country has changed. It's not like our aspirations as a country has changed. And this will drive me to even another thing, the appraisal of whether all the current political formations that we have, from NUP to ANT to UPC to DP, are they advocating anything different, both on paper and in practice, from what the NRM advocates for every day?
My short answer would be absolutely not. There's a lack of grounding in ideology that one sees universally reflected across the board when you critically analyze both the composition but also the spirit and pronouncements of each of the parties and their chief spokespersons. There is a failure to define what makes their vision of the country unique and what nature of society they would like to build should they be given permission by the electorate to be in charge of the commanding heights of our country. So perhaps they are victims of the society less than they are perpetrators of this cyclical, seemingly incurable logic of failing to have a theory of politics that you present to the electorate, but also having a critical mass among the electorate that is willing to take part in fashioning this theory of politics and also voting for it, and also building the kind of reality that they want once you have won the election. I have recently been reading Mamdani's most recent publication, Slow Poison. And in there, he highlights a recurrent concern of Museveni's that has been voiced from the early 80s to as recent as a few months ago. And the president of the country has always said, I have no cadres, very lamentatively, talking about how he has been in charge of a nation for close to 40 years, but he feels that all of the functionaries, all the mandarins of his party and his government, even the people who are bootlicking and acting sycophantically, they are not cadres in the true sense. They do not understand his vision. They do not understand his theory of society. They are simply praise singing in order to get all of these little crumbs and trappings of power and material benefits. But in terms of actually making the necessary sacrifices that are required to bring the revolution to fruition, there are few and far between. And every leader, I think, ultimately rises only as high as the quality of the team that he's able to build around him, because it is the team then that sells the vision to the country. Peasants, needed to make huge sacrifices in Maoist China before China realized all of the benefits that it now has all across Europe, in the French Revolution, in the revolution in England, during the signing of the Magna Carta, as far back as then, you look at the Soviet Union and its own revolution in the early 1900s. People have to believe in this thing hard enough to make sacrifices, not just to put their lives on the line during the war that is going to kick out the old order, but also to follow the leader's directives after peace has been established and nation building is taking place. And I feel that Uganda has failed to achieve that for some of the reasons we've discussed, but also for many others that we are yet to.
Yeah, comrade, the president has this thing that he has said before, right? That some people think that being in power for too long, obviously that was his analysis at some point in his life, that a big problem of Africa was leaders who do not want to leave power, right? Longevity is something that he has found himself falling victim to. Now, he said something along the lines of the fact that some people think experience or staying in power for a long time is a bad thing, but he claims that it has now made him an expert in governance and in governing. Now, I have no doubt about that, because obviously, leading a country and within a region and a continent for that long bequeaths you with certain skills that you can only learn on the job. I think I've always problematized the inability for those lessons to be translated to other people who are trained. And I definitely believe that there's a challenge in our country with that kind of psychophancy that we've observed of folks going, and they're all just going belly flat before the president. And what are they trying to do? Get a few seats here and there. And I think for me, the historic mistake that the president has made is to play into these diversities of interests and interest groups that we have, as opposed to taking a firm stance in order to be able to, continuously rally society towards a national agenda. The way that the NRM conceives of itself, because many commentators have said this, right, that we have never had a multi-party system, that, from day one, the day that we conceded to multipartyism, obviously it was under external pressure for the NRM regime, right? That they had already found ways of entrenching themselves and ensuring that we have a multi-party system only in name. And hence the numerous accusations by the opposition and the reality that you see of being stifled by the government during times for campaigns, even in the off season when they should be mobilizing and consolidating structures on the ground, right? So just as we approach the end of this discussion, right, there's that tendency to think that, okay, maybe that is where the NRM, obviously with the UPDF as the military, the machinery that they need to advance the agenda. If you think of securitized, it's a kind of securitized development where we have a party state apparatus that is pursuing what they believe to be a singular national agenda where there should be no detractors. We've not had anyone in the history of our country master such a grasp of society, such that whatever they wanted to bring about can actually happen. So I think the historic miss here is that the president, more than anybody else before him, and maybe even after him, right, has had this opportunity, given how entrenched his party, himself, and his apparatus is, to then go ahead to make bolder, much more fearless decisions in the national interest. But I think that this has been failing, because if you look at how much patronage, and we'll discuss this maybe in our conversation, next Friday when you talk about parallel governance, that when we've embraced patronage like this, it means that we've failed to make the bold decisions at that level, and we are now pandering to the interest of the public. But there's another question that I have, and maybe we'll use this to close. And you mentioned something about, the fact that our opposition is formed, it's an activist opposition, if you have to characterize it that way. NUP comes in and FDC comes in, all of these people, and what are they talking about? It's a sentiment around anti-Musevenism, right? Which is not an agenda for national transformation. It does not change anybody's life. It's just, let's get rid of this guy. But there's always the question: if we get rid of this guy, then what next? What are you going to do differently, right? That these guys haven't tried. What are you going to do differently that the NRM hasn't tried? Now, obviously, they have had the state to contend with, but they have also had the facts that they have been historically very fragmented, to deal with. You've seen the fate of all the efforts aimed at unity. I think maybe the question would be around whether you think that this is a challenge that could ever be resolved, and what you think the fate of, and whether maybe the eventual demise of the president is going to herald a new phase of coalition politics similar to Kenya for Uganda.
Yeah, that is a tough one. That is a tough one, being able to predict the sort of formations that will
I
emerge.
mean, this is now looking into your crystal ball.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is definitely going to take all of the tricks of the trade that any political analyst may have at their disposal. I would say my sentiments lean towards a very strong negotiated political society that emerges after that, because the divisive kind of segmenting approach of the NRM's 40-year tenure has been to completely demobilize alternative centers of power. And having achieved that objective, it is very difficult to see any actors able to build a critical mass in the immediate exit of Museveni and the NRM. So that it is very much a catch-22 situation, that the country is faced with. In the emergence of a vacuum, should the president, for example, suddenly pass away in office, perhaps the army, if it can remain mutiny-free and faction-free, would be the only institution capable of filling that immediate vacuum. None of the political actors can marshal sufficient respect across the board and sufficient numbers among the civilian population to be able to immediately hold the state together. So the political actors will have to use a united voice to negotiate with the military once the president is no longer in charge. And that is the best case scenario. Yeah.
Is this because of your appreciation of the conception of the military of itself as the guardians and safeguards of the NRA revolution?
Absolutely.
Or this is because you actually think it's necessary that, because there is another scenario in which the army, obviously not in its current outlook, maintains a national character. It remains an army that is subjected to civilian control, right?
I feel like
and
we have run out of time for that possibility. Yeah, given the president's age and any reasonable estimate of how much time he has left on the natural clock, the army, as personalized as it is, as loyal as it is to him and the NRM party, is unable to transform itself soon enough to be willing to take orders from any other political formation and political actor that does not coalesce around the counterweight of representing popular mass voice, so that it is almost impossible to see a non-coalition opposition candidate being able to negotiate effectively with the army. Bobby Wine on his own cannot. Bestje on his own cannot. Even Muntu, who formerly commanded that army, alone as an individual cannot negotiate with the whole apparatus of the UPDF as it stands. It would have to be all civilian opposition politicians forming a united front, a united movement, and then negotiating with the army effectively. Otherwise, we are likely to have a Sudan situation. The moment the civilians lose their unity in negotiating with the army for a peaceful transition to occur.
And just to close, given the historic, elements, indisciplined, I'll add, elements within the army have expressed that sentiment before in regards to Chagulani, for example, that we do not see ourselves saluting this gentleman.
Yeah.
Which is just the height of indiscipline, really, being a part of an army that's supposed to assume a national character. Obviously, there's the unfortunate situation that the commander the chief of defense forces rather, also is the founder of a political formation, that is advancing interests similar to those of the NRA, but also one that he has interests in, so that definitely gives a different flavor and dynamic to
and definitely this united opposition front will have to definitely reject the participation of, for example, the PLU. It will have to outrightly say, you belong in the military, we can only deal with you as an actor in the army. As an actor in the military.
All right, and given their historic divisions, obviously now that is going to be something that it will take some courage and a lot of sacrifice on the part of the actors there. The TDA failed, the IPC historically failed. So our coalitions in the past within the opposition have not really been serious. And it seems that over and over again, new formations formed around individuals tend to be overly excited, and they do not ever develop an appreciation of the need for unity. But hopefully that is a lesson in history that they are going to be able to take up. So we'll pick up from here in our next discussion when we talk about some of the tools of economic management that the current regime has been able to master. Till then, let's keep the conversations going across our platforms, and we look forward to your engagement.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Cheers.
You too. Sign out.
All right.